she is from Vancouver and flew in yesterday. What a great blessing it is to have her here. Oh, good. How wonderful. So she's an international speaker, has given, according to her website, over 700 pro-life presentations all over the world, and is the author of the book that you have, which I really hope you'll dig into as soon as you leave. Love Unleashes Life, Abortion and the Art of Communicating Truth, as well as a physician's guide to discussing abortion. And she's debated many physicians and professors and all sorts of people, and really is an incredible and an articulate speaker. And I personally have really seen her as a hero in the pro-life world and in the speaking world especially. And just, I could go on and on and on, but I really what an incredible woman Stephanie is, and I really have gotten the privilege to know her a little bit, and just am so impressed and so grateful for all that she's doing, because she really is a leader, really emulating what it means to be virtuous and to be a leader. And so I'm just so grateful. So please help me in welcoming Stephanie.
Thank you. Well, it's wonderful to be here. I always love coming to Phoenix. First of all, because I consider this Catholic Disneyland. I'm an amazing diocese, an amazing bishop. And I like to say that in Canada, I live in Canada's best archdiocese, which is Vancouver. But that's because my archbishop is good friends with your bishop, and birds of a feather flock together. So anyways, it's wonderful to be able to be with you on this day where we're really looking at how can we celebrate and how can we defend life. So how can we do that? Well, I think we can and we will do that by heeding the words of our Holy Father, where throughout his pontificate so far he has emphasized time and again that we are to create a culture of encounter. He has used that phrase on numerous occasions, a culture of encounter. And he used that when he came here to the United States. And so I want to read for you one of his quotes in which he references this concept. He said, "We are promoters of the culture of encounter. Dialogue," he said, "is our method. Not as a shrewd strategy, but out of fidelity to the one who never wearies of visiting the marketplace, even at the 11th hour, to propose his offer of love." When I read those words of Pope Francis, 3 parts in particular jumped out at me. And so what I wanted to do this afternoon is dive into 3 aspects of his message and do so by elaborating on my own experience for over a decade working full-time in the pro-life movement, really engaging the culture on the front lines and having that culture of encounter. So the 3 things I want to look at in particular are the following. The first is where Pope Francis said, dialogue is our method. How do we do that? What does that look like? Dialogue is our method, number 1. Number 2, that we're to have fidelity to God. We're to have fidelity to God. What does that look like? Number 3, that we are to propose God's offer of love. So as we think about the culture of encounter through the lens of engaging the culture on the topic of abortion, I want us to look at that in terms of dialogue, fidelity, and love. Dialogue, fidelity, and love. In terms of that first one, our method being dialogue, if we want to know how to dialogue well in this culture of encounter, we need only look to God, who through Christ had many encounters with the culture, dialoguing backward and forth with all kinds of people. And we see in Christ our example of how to make dialogue our method in such a way that we are winsome, that we are persuasive, and we're effective. There are many examples where Jesus throughout the scriptures dialogues with people, but there's one in particular I wanted to reference this afternoon, and that is the 10th chapter of Luke. In Luke 10, a lawyer comes up to Jesus, and he asks Jesus a question. He says, "Teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus' response ought to be our response in our culture of encounter. Instead of getting up on a soapbox and preaching at this lawyer, Jesus asks a question. Jesus wrote the law. He knows the law, so he knows what someone must do to inherit eternal life. But instead of pushing that information into this lawyer, Jesus knows, as God, that he has written the law in that lawyer's heart. And so by asking a question, he can draw the truth out of him instead of preaching and pushing it into him. So in response to the lawyer's question, Jesus says, what does the law say? Well, the lawyer spends his days studying the law. He knows the answer, and so he states the law as it is, love. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. So now the lawyer has really answered his own question. So if he's got any problems, he's going to have a problem with himself, not with Jesus. So at this point, all Jesus has to do is confirm and affirm what the lawyer has said. He says, you're right. Do that, and you will live. This strategy that Jesus employed of engaging people in conversation by asking questions, by drawing information out of them, was something he began long before his public ministry. In fact, the scriptures tell us that when he was 12 years old and he was lost in the temple, that when Jesus and Mary, after days of looking for him, returned and found him, the scriptures say that they saw the 12-year-old Christ child listening and asking questions. At the age of 12, he was already listening and asking questions. And that's what we want to do as we encounter a broken and a wounded and a confused culture that has been fed lies and accepted those lies. We want to be asking lots of questions. If we go back to the exchange between Jesus and the lawyer, after the lawyer responds with that teaching about love, and Jesus says, you're right, then the lawyer looks at Jesus and says, well, who is my neighbor? It's at this point where Jesus employs another tactic, you could say, for effective communication, for good dialogue. Instead of simply asking a question, his next approach is to tell a story. He answers the question, who is my neighbor, through the lens of a story, talking about a man walking down the road to Jericho, which in the days of Jesus was known as the Bloody Pass. The road to Jericho is a very winding, meandering road. It was very conducive to ambushing. It was very dangerous. So when Jesus talks about, to the audience listening, he talks about a man walking down the road, some robbers coming upon him, beating him, robbing him, leaving him half dead, the audience can relate to this. They're instantly thinking, yeah, this is a likely scenario. This happens. By telling a story, their imagination is engaged. By referencing things people can relate to and understand, such as the dangerous nature of the road to Jericho, people are listening. They're relating. Then Jesus takes characters that the audience was very familiar with. A priest, a Levite, Samaritans. The audience knew exactly who those people were, and Jesus starts to insert these characters into his story to illustrate what love of God and love of neighbor really looks like. Putting the other's needs before the self. And so as dialogue is our method in our culture of encounter, engaging people in the topic of abortion, we want to follow in Christ's footsteps. And we want to continually be asking questions and telling stories or coming up with analogies to help lead people to the right conclusion. And so what I want to do is give you some examples of stories and questions that I have used in the encounters I've had so that you can employ things like this in the encounters that you have. A few years ago, I was in Florida at a pro-life exhibit, and I was debating with students who were passing by this display. And at one point, a student came up to me, and she was quite impassioned, and she said, "Do you sit under acorns for shade?" So she knew the importance of asking questions. And I knew where she was going with this, but I didn't let on, and I let her continue. I answered her question. I said, "No, I don't." And she goes, "Exactly. And just as an acorn isn't an oak tree, a fetus isn't a human." So I thought, well, I could talk about the science of when life begins and how fetuses really are human, or I can employ the strategy of asking questions. And first I affirmed her, and I said, "You know what, you're right, I don't sit under acorns for shade." And you bring up an interesting point. Since you've asked me a question, is it okay if I ask you a question? And I said, would you ever hand the keys to your car over to a 5-year-old? She said, well, no. And I said, well, why not? And she said, well, obviously, because a 5-year-old isn't developed enough to know how to drive safely and would hurt themselves, kill themselves potentially, and crash my car. Right, I said, so you recognize that because the 5-year-old is underdeveloped, the 5-year-old can't do what typically adults in our species can do, which is to drive a car. But would you acknowledge that even though a 5-year-old cannot drive a car and should not be given the keys to your car, that the 5-year-old is still a human being? She said, of course. I said, well, in the same way, the acorn, like the 5-year-old, isn't developed enough to adulthood, to maturity, to be able to do what the adult in its species can do. Not drive a car in the case of the oak tree, but to provide shade. That immature, vulnerable little acorn can't do that yet. But the acorn is still of the oak family. It's not in the adult form, but it is after fertilization. The acorn has come to be as a result of the male and female parts of the oak tree, the female being fertilized, and then you have the acorn. So the acorn is a miniature oak, just not the tree. In the same way, the 5-year-old or the fetus is a human, but just not an adult. So to go back to your original point, I said to her, you're right, an acorn isn't an oak tree, but to be accurately parallel, we'd have to say an acorn isn't an oak tree, like a fetus isn't an adult. An acorn isn't an oak tree, like a 5-year-old isn't an adult. But just as the acorn is of the oak family, the fetus is of the human family. We get asked questions, we want to respond with questions as the starting point to be able to explain the pro-life perspective. Or to give another example, I was at a college campus in Western Canada, the University of Victoria, and it seems every college campus I go to, the pro-life students always want to say to me, our campus is the most liberal, or the worst. Well, everyone thinks they're the worst, but let me tell you, the University of Victoria is pretty darn liberal. So this is a campus I have spoken at before, and had to have police presence at before, and I was doing a debate against a philosophy professor, and there were 200 students that had packed into a lecture hall to hear this debate. And just before the debate began, about 10 to 15 protesters suddenly marched in the room holding big placards with, quotes like, keep your rosaries off my ovaries, and things like that. And I was looking at them, totally okay with them being in the room, but a little concerned that they might get vocal, because the people who don't like me tend to get vocal in order to shut down the debate from happening, the presentations from happening. But thankfully, although they came in and they had a visible presence, they were quiet. So I thought, this is pretty amazing. Well, my debate opponent, an older gentleman, as I mentioned, a philosophy professor, very traditional, said, well, ladies first, so I got to go first. And so I had a 20-minute opening to make my argument for this audience for why abortion was an immoral act. And partway through my opening remarks, I wanted to help my audience understand that life begins at fertilization. And I had gone through the science, but bearing in mind the power of stories, the power of analogies, I thought, how can I really hit this point home? That at the moment of fertilization, something that is small and seemingly insignificant nonetheless comes into existence, and is as valuable as we are is as valuable in the moment of fertilization as we all are today. How do I hit this point home? So I remembered an analogy I once read in an article by a law professor by the name of Richard Stiff, referencing an old technology called Polaroid cameras. I know we don't typically use them anymore, but viral laughter, I know in here we're all familiar with them. So I thought, I'm going to take Richard Stiff's reference to a Polaroid camera, and I'm going to make it my own. And so I said to all these students, to help us understand life begins at fertilization, I'd like us to have a little thought experiment. I'd like us to consider for a moment that going through our parents' old things, we discover they have a Polaroid camera. And let's imagine you make this discovery right before you go on vacation. So you think this is fantastic because you never print out your photos anymore. But if you take your parents' Polaroid on vacation with you, you can print out your pictures, finally make a photo album. So your parents give you permission to take their Polaroid on vacation. And I say to the students, let's imagine you go on vacation to where my dad is from, which is not Canada, even though I live there and he lives there. Right, he's fresh off the boat from Scotland. Okay, that's right, my dad's from Farhead, a wee village near Glasgow. So I say to these students, imagine you go to Scotland on vacation, and while you're in Scotland, you go to a very, very famous place in Scotland. Okay, right, it's called Loch Ness. So I said to the students, what's in Loch Ness? And someone says, oh, the monster. I said, right, you know my grandma, she couldn't see her hand in front of her face, she was so blind. But she swore out in the distance she saw Nessie. So I said to these students, let's imagine you go on vacation to Scotland with your parents' Polaroid camera, and you go on a boat tour of Loch Ness. And I said to the students, now imagine as you're on this boat tour, taking photos with a Polaroid camera, a couple hours into the tour, you look over your shoulder, and you suddenly see Nessie. I mean, all the humps and bumps, they're sticking out of the water. So I said to the students, you quickly turn your Polaroid camera fully in that direction, snap a photo, the card comes out, and just as the card comes out, Nessie goes underwater. After telling this little story, I asked the students a question. Would you be upset that Nessie has disappeared? What do you think they said? Yes. But then someone said, well, yeah, but you are holding the picture in your hand. I said, right. Now let's think about that. So, what do you see initially? I asked the students. What do you see? Well, is it really nothing? You had to see black, brown smudges. The students said the same. So then I said, okay, now let's imagine that you do what I think we all know we do when we get a Polaroid picture in our hand, which is what? And a few students started just doing that automatic motion, so they're not that young. They knew how it worked. So then I said, okay, so imagine you start shaking it, thinking, okay, well, Nessie's disappeared. But proof of her existence. I am a student with a lot of student debt. So I'm going to sell this picture, and I'm going to make a lot of money selling it to newspapers and magazines, pay off my student debt. So you're looking at this, shaking it like it's gold. And I said to the students in this little thought experiment, now imagine someone on the boat tour with you has never seen a Polaroid camera before, has no idea how the technology works. They excitedly grab the card from you to have a look at Nessie. But in their minds, all they're looking at is insignificant black-brown smudges. They think the photo didn't take properly, so they rip it and toss it in the lake. Would you be upset? I asked the students. Yes, a bunch of them said. So imagine if in getting angry at the person for destroying your photo, the person responds by saying, it was just black-brown smudges. What do you care about black-brown smudges for? And I said to these students, you'd likely reply, it wasn't just black-brown smudges. Everything about the image of the Loch Ness Monster was captured in an instant. It just needed time to develop. And at that moment, those 15 abortion supporters leapt to their feet and started saying, my body, my choice, my body, my choice. And that's the power of the story. Because it was like the scales fell from their eyes and they realized, oh, that makes a lot of sense. So 45 minutes, we had to wait for the police to come, protesters to leave, then we could carry on with the debate. But the point is, we want to continually be thinking, how can I make analogies? How can I ask questions to keep my audience or the individual I'm speaking with engaged? How can I ask questions and tell stories so as to have an encounter with someone that leads them to the realization of the pro-life message? In another example, I was debating with a teenager about abortion, and she was defending a woman's right to choose. And so at one point in the conversation, we talked for maybe 30 minutes, she was getting a little frustrated. She said, look, if you have a baby in one hand and you have the fetus in the other hand, you're obviously going to prioritize the baby. And I thought to myself that Jesus listened and asked questions. So how do I listen deeply to what she's just said? And I thought, this girl just said something to me that she didn't verbalize. And I started to think about a baby who's born versus a fetus. And I thought, anyone can take care of a baby, but only one person can take care of a fetus. So I thought, in a sense, this baby is more independent and strong, and the fetus is more dependent and weak. So I thought, although she didn't verbalize it, what this girl really said to me was, if you have a strong person in one hand and you have a weaker person in the other hand, you obviously pick the stronger person. And the moment I thought about what she communicated as that, I realized she doesn't really mean what she says. Because civil societies always prioritize weaker people over stronger people, right? Why do we have disabled parking spots and expectant mother parking spots closer to mall entrances, and those of us who aren't disabled and aren't expecting children have to park farther away because more weak, more vulnerable, need extra help, you get priority. So as it should happen, an image went off in my head like a bomb as I thought about what this girl had said, and I thought about, strong versus the weak, and the image happened to be this, which I didn't at the time have on me. But I said to the girl, what you just said about baby versus the fetus is very interesting. I said, it reminds me of a picture my friend recently posted on Facebook. I said, the picture was of a river, and in the middle of the river was something curvy sticking up, but you couldn't really tell what it was. And then I said to this girl, the caption to the picture was, "My husband is a hero." And then I began to explain that underneath the caption, my friend described why. My friend wrote, "My husband is a paramedic, and at midnight he was called to the scene of a car accident. A woman had been driving down the road, lost control of her vehicle, and as it spun out of control, it landed in a nearby river. When my friend's husband got to the scene of the accident, he saw the driver of the vehicle, a woman, sitting on the roof of her sinking car, holding her 10-month-old baby in her arms. My friend's husband jumped in the water, swam towards the car, and then realized," I said to the girl, "he could only take one person at a time to shore." Told my little story, I asked a question. "Who do you think he took first?" I said. She responded, "Well, the baby." I said, "Correct. Why?" And she looked at me like I was crazy, like I didn't know why. But this is the importance of questions. We don't ask because we don't know the answer. We ask because we want the other people to verbalize it. We want them to articulate it. We want them to own it the way the lawyer had to own the law when Jesus asked him what the law said. And so I said to her, no, don't worry, I agree with you. I know I agree he was right to pick the child over the mom, but if you had to explain to someone why you would have done that, what would your reasoning be? She said, well, obviously, if he put the mom first, by the time he got back to the car to get the baby could have rolled over and drowned. I said, correct. So we both think that he made the right decision. And I said to her, summarizing my point, what I think this says about you and me, I said to her, is it seems to me that you and I both agree that when we have a strong person, like the mom, and a weaker person, like the baby in her arms, am I correct that you agree with me that we should put weaker, more vulnerable people ahead of stronger, more independent people? She said, yeah, of course. Then I brought it back to our original discussion. And I said, all that just came to mind in the context of you mentioning the baby versus the fetus. I said, anyone can take care of a baby, but only one person can take care of the fetus. And so because the fetus is weaker and more vulnerable, and because you think we should put weaker and more vulnerable people first, shouldn't we actually prioritize fetuses? She looked at me and said, you argue really well. Notice though, all I did was take what she said, and I paused and I listened to what she didn't even verbalize. Baby versus fetus, strong versus weak. And then I told a story to bring to light a principle I knew was written on her heart. It's the power of stories, the power of questions. To give you another example, a few years ago I was debating another philosophy professor in Eastern Canada, and he began the debate. We picked straws in this case, and he got to go first. So he went first, and he began the debate by saying, I'm going to concede that the fetus is a human person like all of us, and they have the same right to life that all of us have. But I'm going to argue that abortion is still justified with the following rationale. He said, imagine you have a child, maybe 10 years old, and imagine your child has kidney disease. And your child is going to die of this disease unless your child gets a kidney transplant. Now let's imagine that you're the only person in the world as a parent who has the right body type, blood type, and so forth, to be able to donate to your child, your kidney, and thus save your own child's life. He said to the students in the room, would it kill you to donate your kidney to your own child? No, it wouldn't, he said. Would it be nice of you to donate your kidney to your child? Yes, it would, he said. But should the law force you to give your kidney to your child? No, he said, the law should not. Even if your child is a human person, just like you, that human person does not have the right to your kidney. And so in the same way, fetuses are human persons, let's grant that, but they don't have the right to the mother's uterus. So I'm sitting there taking notes, thinking about what I'm going to say when I get my time. And I'm really nervous, thinking, I don't know what to say to this guy. And I was familiar with Judith Jarvis Thompson, who's a philosopher who makes an argument in defense of abortion similar to his, but she creates an analogy where you have two strangers, and do you as a stranger have a right, have a duty to use your body to keep another stranger alive? And I always respond that parents have a responsibility to their children. They don't have to strangers, and fetuses are their children. But what this guy had done was created an analogy where you have a parent-child relationship. And I knew the church, even when it says that it's a good thing, for example, to donate your kidneys, that there is no moral duty to donate our kidneys, even to our children. And so I'm sitting there thinking, I don't know what to say, I don't know what to say. So I begin to pray quietly to myself, looking confident, taking notes like I know what I'm doing, inside dying, and praying. And I didn't hear the audible voice of God, but I did sense that God spoke to me. And I sensed that he said, Stephanie, I made the uterus for a different purpose. And so I began to think about that as I'm fake taking notes, and playing it over and over in my mind, and watching the clock. And then I get up and I say, Dr. Snedden makes a very compelling argument. And it seems that we should side with his perspective until we ask ourselves a question. And what we need to do is ask ourselves, what is the nature and purpose of the kidney versus the nature and purpose of the uterus? Because when we ask that question and get our answer, only then can we see why a parent doesn't have a responsibility to give their kidney to their child, but does have a responsibility to give their uterus to their child. So I said, let's think about the answers to those questions. I said, the kidney exists in a person's body for the very body that it's in. But I said the uterus is very different from the kidney and all other body parts. I said the uterus exists in my body every month getting ready for someone else's body. I said I can live without my uterus, but my offspring cannot. It's a body part that is waiting in great expectation every month for someone else's body, the preborn child, and exists more for them who can't live without it than it exists for me who can live without it. And that's why we don't have an obligation to give our kidneys to our children, but we do have an obligation to give our children's uterus essentially to them. So apparently this professor said to his class a few days later that he was up all night trying to think of a response. So the moral of the story is that is not only the power of questions, but the power of prayer.